Good morning, everybody. My name is Jane McAdam and I'm the Director of the Andrew and Renata Kaldor Centre for International Refugee Law here at UNSW Sydney. And it gives me enormous pleasure to welcome all of you to our 2018 annual conference. I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, the Bedigal people, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. 2018 will go down in history as a significant one for the protection of refugees and migrants, at least on paper. The adoption next month of two new instruments on the movement of people, the Global Compact on Refugees and the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration, signals new moral and political undertakings by the world's governments. These instruments promise to respect the human rights of people on the move, to provide the conditions for them to live in safety and with dignity, and to empower them to enrich the societies in which they live. Such undertakings reaffirm the essence of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted 70 years ago. However, in the current global political environment, commitments such as these could not be taken for granted. Indeed, 2018 was also the year that saw the ongoing but escalating exodus of Venezuelans fleeing for a combination of economic, social, political and humanitarian reasons. Algeria deported thousands of migrants to inhuman conditions, often without examining their legal status or individual circumstances. Hungary enacted unprecedented legislation allowing the imprisonment of anyone assisting undocumented migrants, refugees or people seeking asylum. In traumatic scenes, the United States separated over 2,000 children from their parents as they sought to enter from Mexico. Later, the US confronted asylum seekers at the border with more troops than it had deployed fighting ISIS in Syria. Meanwhile, Italy closed its ports to boats rescuing people seeking asylum and migrants from the Mediterranean. While some refugees on Nauru and Manus Island clocked up more than 5 years, stuck in limbo as part of Australia's offshore processing policy. As UNHCR's Assistant High Commissioner for Protection, Volker Turk, told the world's governments this year, we are facing a watershed moment where two sets of values have emerged in two distinct modes of discourse. It's difficult to reconcile how the positive developments of the past year have occurred alongside the seemingly endless volley of assaults on refugees. This backdrop makes it all the more remarkable that any new agreements were reached at all, let alone ones that reinforce the importance of existing international legal principles and that recognise the positive contributions of refugees and migrants to our societies. It is, of course, lamentable that a number of countries, including Hungary, Austria, Israel, Poland, and two countries built on immigration, the United States and Australia, have indicated that they won't participate in the Migration Compact. Their myopic and inward-looking response panders to xenophobia, rather than to the obvious need to manage migration in a cooperative and orderly manner. The Global Compacts on Refugees and on Migration are intended to enhance international cooperation on human mobility, albeit within a framework that does expressly recognise the primary responsibility and sovereignty of states. These instruments grew out of the 2016 New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants, in which governments expressed profound solidarity with people forced to flee, reaffirmed their obligations to respect the human rights of refugees and migrants, pledged support to assist countries affected by large movements of people, and underlined the centrality of international cooperation to the refugee protection regime, as well as the burdens that large movements of refugees place on national resources, especially for developing countries. The Refugee Compact focuses on enhancing more predictable and equitable responsibility sharing when it comes to large-scale refugee movements and protracted situations. It seeks to prevent displacement where possible, to respond more effectively when people are displaced, and to find solutions, durable solutions, for people who need protection, including by supporting conditions for return and by expanding access to resettlement and other complementary protection pathways. In the Compact's own words, it represents the political will and ambition of the international community as a whole for strengthened cooperation and solidarity with refugees and affected host countries. UNHCR believes that the Refugee Compact marks an evolution in governance of refugee protection, with the potential to make a real difference in the lives of refugees and the communities that host them. If it can do this, it will be a game changer. Whereas the Migration Compact was drafted by states themselves, the drafting of the Refugee Compact was led by UNHCR. But of course, it was still constrained by what states would allow it to do. UNHCR was therefore involved in a very delicate balancing act in discerning where it could push and where it couldn't. As Volker Turk, the Assistant High Commissioner for Protection, explained, it was a question of strategy and a conscious decision not to put up for discussion what is already part of international law and policy. And he said that's why you do see a fairly cautious approach on that in the Compact. In that sense then, the Refugee Compact was building on a long-standing body of international law, not starting from scratch. By contrast, the Migration Compact is in many ways the beginning for the global regulation of migration, offering, as it says, a 360-degree vision. While it also draws on existing human rights principles, it's the first time that the world has adopted a comprehensive agreement on migration generally. It's therefore framed as a milestone in the history of the global dialogue and international cooperation on migration. That compact aims to foster international cooperation among a variety of actors, and it acknowledges that no state can address migration alone. It too seeks to build consensus on principles and practices to improve the management of migration and the rights of migrants. It calls for migration policies that are based on data and evidence, and points to the need to minimise the structural and other drivers that force people to leave their homes in the first place. It affirms the importance of saving lives and of establishing coordinated international efforts on missing migrants to strengthen the transnational response to people smuggling and trafficking as well. The Compact underscores the need to manage borders in an integrated, secure and coordinated fashion, ensuring that migrants have proof of legal identity and adequate documentation, and that there are appropriate screening mechanisms in place in order to ascertain their identity and their protection needs. It addresses the importance of cooperation in the return and readmission of people who don't need international protection or who don't have any other legal basis to remain. It affirms that migrants should not be discriminated against and that they should be able to access basic services and have decent work conditions. It also encourages the use of flexible pathways for migration and recommends the mutual recognition of skills and qualifications. Importantly, both compacts contain concrete frameworks for action to which states can be held to account, at least politically, through new formal review mechanisms. So for the Refugee Compact, there will be a global refugee forum every 4 years, beginning next year, which will be held at the ministerial level to announce concrete pledges and contributions towards the Refugee Compact's objectives, and to consider other ways to enhance responsibility sharing. In the interim, every 2 years, there will be a high-level officials meeting, and there will also be new indicators to measure success towards the achievement of the Compact's objectives. Progress on the implementation of the Migration Compact will be discussed in a 4-yearly International Migration Review Forum from 2022 onwards. There will also be a UN network on migration to work to ensure effective and coherent system-wide support to implementation, follow-up and review of the Compact. At least on paper, these are all positive steps. Their practical effect will take much longer to ascertain, however. Neither Compact is a treaty, neither Compact imposes any new international obligations. So the big question then is whether states will give effect to these compacts so that they can generate real change on the ground. As the Migration Compact acknowledges, our success rests on the mutual trust, determination and solidarity of states to fulfil the objectives and commitments contained in the Compact. And it is with this sense of common purpose that we take this historic step, fully aware that the Migration Compact is a milestone, but not the end of our efforts. What does all this mean then for Australia, both on the international stage and at home? During the drafting of the Global Compacts, Australia was an engaged and often a constructive contributor. It took an active role in the process, which is why its withdrawal from the Migration Compact is somewhat surprising and very unfortunate. Our Prime Minister, Home Affairs Minister and Foreign Affairs Minister are simply wrong when they say that the Migration Compact fails to adequately distinguish between people who enter Australia illegally and those who come the right way, particularly with respect to the provision of welfare and other benefits. The Compact doesn't do anything of the sort. Likewise, the Home Affairs Minister's concern that the Migration Compact would give Australian courts grounds to undermine the government's policy and let more refugees stay in Australia is a total red herring. The Migration Compact isn't about refugees at all, and it's not an instrument that would bind Australian courts either. Not even international treaties can be invoked directly in Australian courts, so a non-legally binding instrument like the Migration Compact would have even less influence in this way. While the Refugee Compact is focused on large-scale and protracted refugee situations, which Australia's never experienced, Australia can play an important role in providing support to host countries and durable solutions for refugees. We have history as our leader in this regard. Our partnerships in humanitarian assistance, development, technical and financial support are crucial, as is our commitment to ongoing and enhanced resettlement. We also have an important opportunity to ramp up alternative pathways to admission, including family reunification, private and community sponsorship schemes, educational scholarships, labour mobility opportunities for refugees, and special emergency humanitarian intakes, which is the subject of a new Kaldor Centre policy brief, which will be released in early December. In particular, Australia should leverage the existing goodwill of many in our private sector to improve and expand a community sponsorship model, learning lessons and effective practices from the 40-year-old Canadian scheme. As the Canadian Immigration Minister told us here when he spoke at UNSW earlier in the year, in Canada, this program has been transformative, not just for the refugees themselves, but also for the sponsors in the community. He said, although legally people are only required to sponsor an individual refugee for 1 year, the relationships that they form usually last much longer than that. Again, although legally the sponsors are only obliged to take care of them, we found that their neighbours and friends also take part in that experience and embrace these refugees. Refugees are no longer an abstract concept. They are real people who become essentially part of their family. He said his predecessor used to say that he was the only immigration minister in the whole world that couldn't bring enough refugees to satisfy the Canadian demand for refugee sponsorship. In Australia though, 2018 hasn't seen many improvements for refugees and people seeking asylum. We have witnessed the steady, if not accelerating, deterioration of the mental and physical health of people held on Nauru and Manus Island, which has been described by experts as worse than they have seen in any war zone or refugee camp around the world. Even the former head of Australia's Border Force, Roman Quadley, remarked on this. He described sites as reminiscent of the worst slums he'd ever seen, with unsettling signs of the volatility of an incarcerated population and the omnipresent but indefinable sense of dread and foreboding. In October, 3 government MPs called for the urgent removal of refugee children and their families from Nauru, thanks in large part to the tireless advocacy of many of you in this room. In the past few months, almost 100 children have been removed, transferred to Australia, and around 17 now remain there. Many in Australia are now living in detention centres or hospitals or under guard in hotels. The Refugee Council of Australia has expressed concern that some families have been separated as a result of the transfer process, with people left on Nauru or put into different detention centres or different parts of Australia. There are still no resettlement options available to these people at the moment, and the Australian government has even indicated it might send them back to Nauru at some point. This is no solution at all. Within Australia, far fewer asylum seekers are now held in mandatory detention than just a few years ago, which is of course a positive thing. But we can't look at that in isolation. It's a result of the combined policies of boat turnbacks, offshore processing, and the denial of resettlement in Australia. Things that themselves are inconsistent with what international law demands. The 300 odd men who are detained have been in detention on average now for 2 years, some for more than 7 years. Many are unwell and face severe psychological distress. Life for the 30,000 asylum seekers in our community is not that rosy either. In August, the government made significant cuts to social support, with about 60% of asylum seekers losing their benefits of $250 a week, losing casework support and access to torture and trauma services. This is even if they don't have a job or any other way of supporting themselves. According to the Refugee Council, such cuts are likely to leave thousands of people destitute, hungry and homeless. In the United Kingdom, similar actions that resulted in asylum seekers becoming destitute were found to constitute inhuman and degrading treatment, contrary to international human rights law. We all know that it doesn't have to be like this, and it shouldn't be like this. When the Canadian Immigration Minister talked to us earlier this year about people seeking asylum in his country, he said, "Lucky for us, we have held firm on the notion that we can both apply Canadian law to make sure that we respect Canadian law and process everyone fairly and equally, and to make sure that we can protect the safety and security of Canadians, while at the same time staying true to our commitment to the Refugee Convention and other international commitments that Canada's signed up to make sure that people fleeing persecution and who claim asylum in our country at least have the opportunity to be given a fair hearing so that they can make their case. If they are then able to establish in front of an independent body that they deserve refugee protection, they get to stay." In Australia, we've moved far away from this position, in political rhetoric, in law, and in practice. Let's reimagine how it could be, with a bit of leadership, commitment, and follow-through. Here's what we need to do. We need to return to complying with our international legal obligations and ensuring that they are fully reflected in domestic law. We need to provide reception conditions that give people seeking asylum access to medical care, to work, to education, and other assistance that will enable them to live in dignity in the community, pending the determination of their protection claims. We need to provide a fair, efficient and transparent system for processing asylum claims with well-trained decision makers, harking back to the days when our system was held up as a model of best practice. We need to create safe and legal pathways to protection, while also addressing the root causes of displacement. We need to respect the principles of family unity and the best interests of the child, recognising that mutual support among family members is critical to people's resilience, including their integration and success in new communities. We need to invest in settlement and integration, which requires a commitment to education, to training, skills transfer, and recognition of qualifications, and the promotion of business partnerships to facilitate employment opportunities for refugees. These things are key steps in paving the way for long-term success for all of us by investing in refugees as people and by enabling them to acquire the skills and resilience to contribute to our communities, whether those communities are here in Australia, back in the country of origin, or somewhere else in the world. As UNHCR's Assistant High Commissioner for Protection reminded the world's governments this year, human dignity must be front and centre when it comes to refugee protection. Dignity, he said, is central to the progressive development and implementation of law and standards for refugee protection. And it's the antidote to dehumanisation, which prevents us from seeing the other as a human being with rights, needs and dignity, and desensitises and numbs our conscience, enabling easy slippage into mistreatment and policies of cruelty, because it prevents empathy and compassion from shaping our response. Just as to deny one person's dignity is ultimately to deny our own, he said, the responsibility to ensure one person's dignity is the responsibility of us all. Since 1945, Australia has played a key role in providing protection opportunities for refugees, both by resettling people in need from overseas and for many years by enabling people seeking asylum here to apply and be granted protection. Refugees have helped to make this country what it is today. The success of earlier programs like post-war nation-building labour schemes, which gave displaced people from Europe the chance of a new life, means that Australia can have confidence in the positive contributions that refugees will make when offered opportunity and hope. Providing a welcome, secure and respectful environment for refugees results in benefits for everyone and in a stronger, more socially cohesive country. As the Canadian Immigration Minister has pointed out, talent is more mobile than ever. Investment is more mobile than ever. People want to go where they're accepted and included. Surely Australia has the confidence and the ability to see this vision realised once again. Finally, 2018 marks the Kaldor Centre's 5th birthday. I am honoured to have had the opportunity to establish and lead such a committed and capable team of people. In fact, it is our people who make the centre what it is. And I would like to thank our researchers, Professor Guy Goodwin-Gill, Dr. Claire Higgins, Dr. Sangeetha Pillay and Madeline Gleeson, as well as our professional team of Frances Voon, Kelly Newell and Lauren Martin for their outstanding work and collegiality. I would also like to thank UNSW, the law faculty, and of course Andrew and Renata Kaldor, without whom the centre simply wouldn't exist. And I'd of course like to thank all of you for your ongoing support in so many ways. And really finally, I would like to wish all of our American visitors a very happy Thanksgiving. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Andrew Kaldor, and it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Anne Richard. Before I do so, I'd also like to thank Jane for that very clear review of the last 12 months and really the world situation in regard to migration and refugees. Jane also mentioned that this is our 5th anniversary. And I should acknowledge Jane as well as the whole team that she has thanked for her extraordinary leadership. The Centre, I'm proud to say, has become the leading global institute for research in refugees. And there's never been a more important time than at the moment for the discussion and propagation of ideas about how to move forward in protection and the management of refugee and displaced people flows. And in that way, I too have to say how appalled I am at the government's refusal to sign the Compact on Migration. It's shameful that we are associated with a group of ultranationalists in refusing to do this, and I hope that before the next 4 years are out, that the government changes its mind for one reason or another and joins in multilateral efforts to do this. Let me to again welcome you to this conference. The subjects we're discussing are critical in these times of rising populism and nationalism, and I look forward to a very fruitful discussion. Before I introduce Professor Richards, I should let you know some housekeeping matters. Morning tea will be served downstairs at the conclusion of Professor Richards' address, and we will reconvene at 11 a.m. sharp for the first panel discussion. I'm concerned that we may be running a few minutes late, but I'm sure with the efficiency of our ushers we'll start again at 11. Now let me turn to Professor Richard. We're very fortunate to have such a distinguished keynote speaker. Professor Richard is a Centennial Fellow at the Welsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. She's had a very distinguished academic career, and she, when I asked her, do you want me to go through your very long CV, she said, no, just say I'm an academic and I've worked in a lot of NGOs. And she has certainly done that. But in particular, what I was interested in was quizzing her about her role as Assistant State Secretary for Population, Migration and Refugees during the Obama administration, when she was responsible for negotiating the deal between Australia and the US for the transplant of refugees on Nauru. I can't imagine a more apt person to discuss the rise and fall of US diplomacy on refugees and migrants inside recent history. So with that, I welcome Professor Richard.
Thank you very much. Thank you to Andrew and thank you to everyone really for the incredibly warm welcome for me and for my husband Will, my son Max, and our friend Emma Jones. We're so happy to be in Australia. It's summer here. It is my first time here, although I've met and worked with and learned from many smart and caring Australians over the years. And before launching into my remarks, I too would like to thank several people. The invitation to speak today came from the much respected Guy Goodwin Gill, and it is wonderful to come to Sydney to see him and Kaldor Center Director Jane McAdam on their home turf. Of course, without the Kaldors, there would be no Kaldor Center to issue an invitation and celebrate a 5th anniversary. So, happy anniversary, Renata and Andrew. Frances Voon, Kelly Newell, and Lauren Martin helped in myriad ways to ensure that I was able to accept the invitation, get here, and talk to some journalists in advance. Thanks also to the Ian Potter Foundation for its support of my visit. Finally, I believe the idea for the theme for this conference came from a discussion with Claire Higgins that we had at Georgetown University. So thank you, Claire. You make a splendid and informative citizen diplomat abroad for Australia. I'm also very pleased to see and be reunited with some of the Australians who were leaders on humanitarian issues in Geneva, like Erica Feller and John Quinn. I do need to offer an apology to Lauren Martin. She asked for an advance copy of the speech, and I kept working on it, and I kept assuring her she'd have it soon, and then I would send her these emails raving about my visit to the Sydney Opera House, and sharing photos from the top of the Sydney Harbour Bridge, and I shook the sand from Bondi Beach out of my bathing suit and told her I'm still working on the speech. But this keynote is my top priority during this visit to Australia. So without further delay, let me commence. And I'll commence by saying this is an odd time in the United States. I realize this is stating the obvious, but for those of us who work on refugee and migration issues, the world as we know it has completely changed. Aiding the world's refugees was a priority in the Obama administration, particularly in response to record-setting levels of displacement around the world. The pro-refugee policies of the Obama administration have come under attack by Donald Trump. First, during his campaign for president, and coming up on 2 years now during the Trump administration. So I'd like to share with you a summary of what we did and tried to do to help refugees in the Obama administration, and then discuss what has happened with President Trump. And with you, I'd like to consider the role Australia and other leading nations play in all of this. As a starting point, let me note that for decades in the United States, we've had bipartisan support for helping refugees. Certainly within the Obama administration and throughout the foreign policy and national security team, there was strong support for doing more to help refugees. Early on, my predecessor, Eric Schwartz, today the head of Refugees International, took steps to upgrade the U.S. refugee resettlement program and put it on a sounder financial footing so it could better weather changes like those spawned by the economic downturn we experienced in 2008 and increases in the cost of housing. In 2011, leaders in the administration responded to the FBI's arrest on terrorism charges of 2 Iraqi refugee plotters in Bowling Green, Kentucky, by temporarily suspending the flow of refugees from Baghdad and undertaking a thorough scrub of the refugee vetting process. White House officials held frequent meetings with law enforcement, intelligence, and national security agencies to ensure that all the pieces in the process fit together and that our partners at the Department of Homeland Security ran the names and biometric data of refugee applicants through all relevant national security databases before accepting anyone for resettlement. When I took office in early April 2012, my priorities included convincing Congress to maintain robust funding levels for refugee aid and to expand the number of refugees coming to the United States. We put a greater focus on helping refugee women and girls and other vulnerable groups, built bridges with counterparts at USAID to ensure U.S. humanitarian policy was aligned. USAID is the U.S. Agency for National Development. And worked constructively with leaders heading up UN humanitarian agencies and well-regarded non-governmental organizations. Congress appropriated nearly $7 billion per year for humanitarian assistance. And the bureau I led was responsible for $3.4 billion, or nearly half of that. The rest went to disaster and food aid accounts of the U.S. Agency for National Development. The U.S., I like to say, provided the backbone of the international humanitarian system, serving as a top funder of the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, UNICEF, the World Food Program, UNRWA, which is the UN Relief Works Agency for Palestine refugees in the Near East, the International Organization for Migration, and the International Committee of the Red Cross. With the exception of the Swiss-run ICRC, an American traditionally ran or was the number 2 at all of these organizations. In addition to deep involvement in humanitarian policy development and allocation of aid, I undertook a number of efforts related to diplomacy on broader international migration issues. For example, I joined with Permanent Representative of Mexico to the UN in New York, Luis Alfonso D'Alba, to discuss migration in New York to a UN audience. Attendees were amazed the US and Mexico could appear together amicably to discuss these topics. This joint appearance was in the run-up to the Secretary General's high-level dialogue on migration in October 2013. I led the US delegation to the high-level dialogue and also led interagency US delegations to meetings of the Global Forum for Migration and Development, held in subsequent years in Sweden, Turkey, and Bangladesh. I conspired with then IOM head, famous American diplomat, Bill Swing, and UN leaders who sought to secure US support for adding the International Organization for Migration to the UN family of agencies. With other countries, we developed and promoted voluntary guidelines to help migrants who were caught in countries that erupted in crisis or were crippled by natural disasters. And we were somewhat amazed when these received widespread support. Many of these efforts related to global migration went unnoticed by the US press. Nonetheless, I thought they were important to do, knowing that the President wanted the US to engage through multilateral mechanisms and believing that the United States had a very good story to tell about how we ourselves treated refugees and migrants. Most of my time, however, was devoting to shaping the U.S. humanitarian response to too many crises taking place around the world. Syria was chief among these, producing millions of refugees and internally displaced persons and savage attacks against innocent civilians in Syrian cities. Administration, foreign policy leaders, and Middle East experts devoted thousands of hours in pursuit of peace, but were defeated time and time again. Stymied on the diplomatic front, more pressure was placed on humanitarian efforts to succeed. At times, humanitarian efforts were the only topic on which the US had anything positive to say. ISIS evolved and rampaged and sent Syrians and Iraqis fleeing for their lives. During this time, South Sudan fell into civil war, and once again, people there ran to neighboring countries. I traveled to northern Rakhine State, Myanmar, and to Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, and wrestled with concerns for the Rohingya. They then numbered about 130,000 people, and of course, the number now is much, much greater. Closer to 1 million have fled Myanmar. The situation in Somalia that sent refugees fleeing to Kenya and across to Yemen was then complicated by a brutal war in Yemen that continues to this day. I also tried to bring attention to neglected crises, traveling to a remote region of Burkina Faso to meet refugees from Mali with then High Commissioner for Refugees, Antonio Guterres, and later traveling with the EU Commissioner for Humanitarian Affairs, Christos Stylianides of Cyprus, to countries in Africa where Nigerians fleeing Boko Haram were sheltered. And I looked for those rare opportunities to celebrate victories, from prospects to peace in Colombia to much smaller successes in building permanent homes for refugees displaced years before in the Balkans. One of the things that helped me do my job was the fact that there were no serious divisions on humanitarian policy within the administration. Everyone, from the President and First Lady, Vice President and Dr. Biden, the National Security Advisor, Secretaries of State Clinton and Kerry, their deputies, and other senior administration officials, everyone cared and wanted the administration to succeed in doing more. So asking cabinet officers to raise humanitarian issues on their travels and in their high-level meetings was not hard. This, too, is what we meant by the term humanitarian diplomacy, that humanitarian concerns were folded into messages to be delivered to foreign counterparts by American diplomats, up to and including the President. In the summer of 2015, the massive number of refugees and migrants seen traveling by leaky rafts across the Mediterranean and by foot through Europe en route to Austria, Germany, and Sweden got high-level White House and public attention. There are 2 dates from 2015 burned into my memory. On September 3rd, the photo of the little toddler, Alan Kurdi's body, washed up on the beach in Turkey went viral. We were promptly inundated with calls from those demanding that the Obama administration do more to help refugees. And our friends on the political left insisted we move faster to bring more Syrian refugees to America. At the same time, we heard from many conservatives who cautioned us against bringing more Muslim refugees to the United States, out of fear that these refugees would import Sharia law and terrorism into the United States. These concerns exploded after the Paris attacks of Friday evening, November 13th. The second date I remember well. Suddenly, every member of Congress wanted to know if terrorist refugees were headed to the United States. Even those who supported the refugee program demanded guarantees that the resettlement program could keep out bad guys. And I said we were doing everything humanly possible to screen out liars, criminals, and would-be terrorists. In response to all of these events, record levels of refugees, waves of migrants reaching Europe, drownings in the Mediterranean, and exaggerated fears of terrorists disguised as refugees, the UN decided to hold a major meeting in New York on refugees and migrants. This took place on September 19th, 2016. A second international meeting was held on September 20th, the day after the first. It was spearheaded by President Obama and aim to increase support for refugees. The UN organized meeting produced the New York Declaration on Refugees and Migrants. The New York Declaration in turn launched 2 processes to develop a global compact or voluntary agreement on refugees and a second global compact on migrants. Now, you have just heard Jay McGannon give a brilliant description of the state of play with these, and I know that these were the subjects of last year's Kaldor Center conference, and I look forward to the panel that will discuss these global compacts later today. The time to focus on them is right now. President Obama's Leaders Summit on September 19th was modeled on a meeting a year before to boost support for UN peacekeeping. At that earlier meeting, governments were invited to attend if they committed to contribute more money, troops, and/or equipment for peacekeeping. For the Leaders Summit on Refugees, countries that wanted to attend had to earn an invitation by making commitments in advance. Wealthy countries were asked to provide more in humanitarian assistance and to accept more refugees for resettlement. Countries that hosted refugees were also asked to do more by permitting refugees to work legally and allowing refugee children to go to school. The diplomatic outreach in advance of this summit was tricky. White House officials, cabinet officers divvied up the list of foreign leaders to contact and encouraged to participate. Several countries very swiftly stepped forward to co-sponsor the event, and the number of Western European co-sponsors had to be limited, while finding refugee hosting countries willing to co-sponsor was a challenge. The list of co-sponsors ended up being the UN Secretary General, Canada, Ethiopia, Germany, Jordan, Mexico, and Sweden. Staff at the National Security Council, Ambassador Power's office in New York, and the State Department's Bureau for International Organizations, our sister bureau, played major roles in putting the summit together. My staff was asked to focus particularly on coming up with ways that refugee hosting countries could be asked to do more, and to review the political situation and economic and humanitarian context for each of these countries. This was a particularly delicate matter, as many of these countries had hosted large refugee populations for decades, with limited resources, little recognition, and minimal thanks from rich countries. I encouraged some of the poorest countries to make new commitments and earn an invitation. Some were shocked to discover that invitations were not automatic and called the system pay to play, or what one outraged diplomat called the most undiplomatic request he'd ever heard. I'm so proud to have delivered the most undiplomatic request. I also frankly acknowledge that their doing more should be contingent on getting help from the United States and other major donor countries. And we all agree that increased aid flows for education and skills building should benefit not just the refugees, but also local populations. Australia pledged an increase in aid, especially in response to the Syria crisis, and to maintain a generous resettlement program. Altogether, some 49 countries attended, in addition to UN and World Bank leaders. The World Bank used the opportunity to announce its Global Crisis Response Platform, a new financing mechanism for low and middle-income countries hosting refugees. UNHCR and IOM announced a joint mechanism to help countries start new or expand refugee resettlement programs. President Obama also addressed a group of business leaders in a smaller side meeting to encourage more aid to refugees from the private sector, something that then and now remains a work in progress. The desire of Europeans to see US leadership on these issues was satisfied. The conference was deemed a success in nearly every aspect, save one. Would there be follow-up? Had Hillary Clinton been elected president, which was then the expectation, I believe her administration would have championed strong diplomatic follow-through on the list of commitments. Needless to say, there has been no top-level push from the Trump White House. No single country chose to reconvene the participants for a second summit. However, UNHCR and the World Bank have used the very detailed list of commitments to engage the various participating countries as a basis for continued dialogue. During that whirlwind week in New York, in the midst of these important September 19th and September 20th meetings, I met up with Rachel Noble, the then Deputy Secretary Policy Group in Australia's Immigration and Border Protection Department. Today, I understand she is Deputy Secretary of the Home Affairs Implementation Team in that same department. We met in a small, windowless conference room at the U.S. Mission to the United Nations. There, with a little fanfare and few witnesses, we signed the Australia-U.S. deal on refugees, which had been negotiated over the previous months. I had played a leading role in the negotiations, but I was part of a team of State Department negotiators and resettlement experts under the overall guidance of the Deputy Secretary for Management and Resources, Heather Higginbottom. And we had the full backing of Secretary Kerry. We agreed with Australia not to publicize the deal until after the US election, to avoid it adding fuel to the anti-refugee rhetoric that was already churning. Not, let me make clear, to help Hillary Clinton win, as that was a foregone conclusion in Washington, but to keep this diplomatic arrangement from getting caught up and tarnished by the vitriol and misinformation that was then swirling and that we considered temporary. There is no truth to the rumor that President Obama cooked up the deal after the election in November 2017 to annoy the Trump administration. In fact, the negotiations proceeded at the State Department over months without much direct involvement from the White House, although we certainly stayed in touch with colleagues there at every step and had President Obama's overall support and guidance for increasing the numbers of refugees admitted to the United States. And I will return to the topic of the Australia-US deal in a moment. Candidate Trump made immigration a top issue of his campaign, and in hindsight, I see that it helped him win votes from his core supporters. It all started with Donald Trump's announcement that he was running for president in June 2015 at Trump Tower after arriving via escalator. He delivered remarks that included his vow to build a wall and make Mexico pay for it, and accused Mexico of sending north drug smugglers, criminals, and rapists. Not only was this a horrible insult against Mexicans, it was also out of date regarding flows across the southwest border, where in recent years, the number of Mexican workers coming north decreased significantly. Instead, large number of children and families fleeing crime, violence, and insecurity in Central America were arriving. When Donald Trump won the November 2016 election, my hope was that we could meet with his transition team in December and early January and explain to them the importance of these programs. But the Trump team was very slow to come together, and not much happened at the State Department before the inauguration in January. I met only once with 2 or 3 people representing the new administration, but these individuals did not stay long at the department and were not involved in briefing the incoming secretary, Rex Tillerson. During the entire 2.5 months long transition period, there was no organized handoff to a new set of decision makers. This was unusual for any administration, Democratic or Republican. So I left office on January 19th, 2017, not knowing who would be coming in, and in the 22 months since I left office, no one has replaced me. The position of Assistant Secretary, as well as the post of Undersecretary to whom I reported, and other key jobs and ambassadorships at the State Department remain unfilled. The office of the Deputy Secretary for Management and Resources that Heather Higginbottom filled has been eliminated, at least for the time being. A man named Ronald Mortensen has had his name put forward by the White House to take my old job. He has a background in the logistics of disaster response overseas, but is not an expert on refugees or migrants, and has written essays that are anti-immigrant, accusing the Dreamers, undocumented youth who came to the U.S. As children, of felonies. His nomination has not been acted on by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, although the leadership of that committee is changing with the new Senate, so perhaps he will one day get a hearing. So a new Assistant Secretary never arrived, but the Bureau has been receiving guidance directly from the White House, beginning with the surprise of the travel ban. Several days into the new administration, the travel ban was launched as an executive order and without careful review. It stopped refugee travelers in their tracks with zero warning, which was not only a bad management move, it was cruel to do to people who had waited so long and sold many of their possessions in order to make the trip. Career staff in the department immediately sought a waiver to allow refugees who had commenced their travel to the United States to complete it. Meanwhile, the international arrivals area of major airports were thronged with ordinary Americans protesting the travel ban, condemning it as a ban on Muslim travelers to the United States. Today, 22 months later, the White House has slashed the number of refugees being resettled in the United States from nearly 85,000 arrivals in the last full fiscal year of the Obama administration to 22,491 in the fiscal year that just ended September 30th. The 9 faith-based and nonprofit networks that combined resettle refugees in cities and towns across the United States have been forced to close offices. And the State Department announced this past spring that it will trim the list of 9 to a smaller number of partners to carry out this work. This means fewer cities will be involved in the U.S. refugee admissions programs. The staff and volunteers who help the refugees will lose their jobs and roles, and the highly successful public-private partnership that has been built up over years, with years of connections to and relationships with landlords and employers and synagogues and churches and schools, will be lost. The Trump administration has done more than drop the number of refugees arriving in the United States. It has stopped a program to unify Central American children with parents that are lawfully present in the United States as refugees, or by granting them humanitarian parole. And this program was started under the Obama administration with the aim of reducing the number of children making the dangerous trip north from Central America. It has threatened to end temporary protective status, or TPS, for people who came to the U.S. years ago but have been unable to return home because the crisis or conditions that originally prevented them from returning home have not improved. It has stopped funding UNRWA, the UN Relief Works Agency for Palestine refugees in the Near East, which provides education and healthcare and other services to 5 million Palestinian refugees. It has, predictably, stopped funding the UN Population Fund, UNFPA, which, in addition to other programs, provides reproductive health services to women in crisis zones, improving survival rates for mothers and babies. It nominated an American to lead the International Organization for Migration, who was found to have sent a series of anti-Muslim tweets. He lost his election, and America lost the leadership of that organization. The Trump administration has proposed deep cuts in the budgets of the State Department and U.S. Agency for National Development, cuts that, fortunately, have been overturned by Congress. It has succeeded in driving some of the most seasoned diplomats into retirement. The staff in my former bureau has twice had to fight off proposals to have the bureau eliminated, which has been a major distraction and sapped morale. The Trump administration has walked away from the Global Compact on migration and encouraged other countries to do the same. Recently, then Attorney General Sessions issued guidance that judges should no longer grant asylum to survivors of domestic violence or to people fleeing criminal gangs, arguing that these situations do not fit within the legal definition of a refugee. The list of missteps, mistakes, and cruel measures to hurt immigrants and other foreign-born is much longer than what I've outlined here. The most notable move was to cruelly separate children from their parents at the border, and this received national attention and condemnation. To put it succinctly, the U.S. administration has turned its back on the world's refugees at a time of historic levels of displacement. 25 million people are refugees, another 3 million are asylum applicants around the world, more than 40 million are displaced within their own home countries and called internally displaced persons, or IDPs. The Obama administration allies had tried to rally the world to do more, but some governments have moved in a different direction entirely. In addition to the about-face toward refugees in the White House, we see countries in Eastern Europe led by anti-migrant politicians. Populism and nationalism are on the rise throughout Europe. While Germany marshaled its resources to deal with the influx of migrants and refugees in the summer of 2015, the EU was initially unable to come together to address the situation, was slow to institute proper screening programs, and a workable relocation scheme did not receive support from many EU's member states. Instead, walls sprang up and stopped the flow from Greece, Subsequently, Brussels focused on paying off Turkey and other countries of transit, and European donors are belatedly investing more aid in countries of origin, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. Such investment is a very good thing to do for several reasons, but may not stop people from wanting to move to find better opportunities. I am very happy that the Australia-US deal has survived changes at the top in both of our governments. Refugees continue to be screened and moved from these two offshore sites to the United States, albeit in small numbers and very slowly. And regrettably, the Trump administration is allowing only minuscule numbers of Syrians, Iranians, and other Muslims from certain countries to be brought in. Incidentally, I believe the transcript of the Turnbull-Trump phone conversation from January 2017 is the best summary of the US-Australia deal you will find. Much of the details of the deal are still classified. Without revealing classified material, I have tried to inform journalists that the initial coverage of the deal was wrong. This is not a one-for-one swap of refugees, and there is no magic number or mathematical formula to determine whether and when Australia fulfills its side of the deal. With regard to refugees, in return for taking up to 1,200 refugees from Manus and Nauru, America asked Australia to do more to help refugees from regions beyond South and Southeast Asia, such as Africa and Central America. My own involvement in and support for the deal, and I know former Deputy Secretary Higginbottom would say the same, was prompted by concern for the refugees themselves. Like I say, this is my first trip to this part of the world, and I have visited neither Nauru nor Papua New Guinea. But the reports we had read about the conditions for the refugees were very worrying. This fact was reinforced by several of the refugees who have been resettled from Nauru in the United States when we met recently. I also spoke by phone with a refugee resettled from Manus. They described a hellacious environment. Men slept in bunk beds, 40 men to a tent, or several families to a tent, and for 3 years the tents did not have fans. Meanwhile, the heat was oppressive. The tents also failed to keep out rain. They told me the food was bad, the staff treated them as if they were criminals, and the local people were hostile too, and stole their mobile phones. They had nothing to do but spend day after day after day waiting. They watched movies. Many took the initiative to learn English. They waited 6 or 7 hours for a 1-hour turn to use the internet over a very slow connection. 1 day a week they were allowed to visit a gym for 1 hour. The heat made it impossible to nap or sleep during the day, and this was a particular burden on families with small children. One said, "I watched an Iranian set himself on fire and small children go crazy." One of the refugees from Nauru was smart, friendly, and particularly bitter. He said he lost 6 years of his life that he would never get back. He had harsh words, even for visits from well-intentioned representatives of aid agencies and rights groups. They took lots of notes, he said, but they could do nothing to help us leave Nauru. He wondered if they had written everything down only to put these reports in the trash. "We were like animals in the zoo," he said. When I asked Imran, the Rohingya refugee who'd spent time on Manus, how he felt when he heard that some might go to America, he told me he did not believe it. He said that he did not trust any of the information provided by officials about options for the refugees, such as resettlement in Cambodia or Central Asia. Still, he has great warmth and affection for the Australian couple, Sandra and Len Fulham from Mount Isa, in Queensland, who connected with him and a second detainee via Facebook in 2015 and have since visited the 2 young men in the United States. The refugees who had been on Nauru were very grateful to their English teachers and have remained in touch with them, even though one was dismissed after giving them a gift of chewing gum. To them and to other caring Australians, the Rohingya refugee asked me to deliver a message. Thank you, for we could not have survived without you. The offshore processing model succeeded in keeping refugees arriving by boat from reaching Australia's shores, but it has extracted a heavy human toll from the refugees themselves. Of particular concern to all of us is the serious harm that has come to children and some of the refugees who were attacked in Manus or were so driven to despair that they committed suicide. But all of them deserve our attention and help. I know that what I am saying is not news here in Australia. So, how are they faring in the United States? Sri Lankan parents with 3 children, one of the children is a baby, born under difficult circumstances in Nauru, were happy that their children would receive an education, have a good future, and experience freedom in the United States. The father, however, also felt stressed as earnings from his job at an Indian restaurant were not sufficient to pay the rent for a 2-bedroom apartment and other bills. Several young men from Pakistan are now working in jobs at the bottom of the academic ladder. One was working the graveyard shift at the 7-Eleven convenience store, and another, who had earlier studied medicine, was now a landscaper. Still in their early 20s, they are eager to earn high school equivalency degrees and then continue their educations. Another, who earlier in life was an artist, is now a 38-year-old chef cooking Mexican food and remains separated from his wife and child left behind in Pakistan. I asked the guy working at the 7-Eleven, I said, do people think you're Hispanic? And he says, oh yeah, they come in and they go, hola, hola, and so I say, hola, amigos. The refugee from Manus is now working and attending school. They mentioned that one big change is that local people are not nasty to them when they hear they are refugees. They also tried to stay in touch with those still on Manus and Nauru. All of the refugees I met from Nauru completely rejected the idea that many of those who've been resettled now want to return. The Rohingya refugee in Chicago, who had been on Manus, thought at most 1 or 2 would want to return to be reunited with people they care very much about, or because starting life over again in America, while the fervent wish of many, is very, very challenging, even to refugees who've been sufficiently resilient to survive displacement, the dangerous journey across countries, and the years of stultifying life on the islands. I hesitate to say more, in part because you are the real experts about Australian policies, and in part because I do not want to do anything to undermine this deal. Instead, let's look at the global phenomenon we see of hostility to refugees and asylum seekers. With the notable exception of Canada, as Jane mentioned, many countries seem to be turning their backs on refugees. In the US and our southwest border, the administration has sought to dismiss the asylum claims of migrants who cross the border away from official checkpoints. I am so glad that a federal judge just this past week temporarily blocked the administration from denying asylum to those who enter the United States this way. But I remain extremely worried about the global prospects for the right to asylum. In the United States, during the Cold War, it was well understood that visiting Russian ballet dancers, or Cuban baseball players, or Chinese musicians might leave their groups and claim asylum. And providing them this asylum so that they could stay in the land of the free was seen as a logical thing to do and the right thing to do. Of course, there have also been periods in US history where those whose families arrived earlier tried to keep out new arrivals, from the Chinese exclusion laws to the way the St. Louis and its Jewish refugees from Europe were turned away in 1939, to concerns about the trustworthiness of people fleeing communist Eastern Europe and Vietnam in later decades. Today, we not only see that people fleeing for their lives from the Northern Triangle countries of Central America or from war in Syria do not automatically receive sympathy from a segment of American society. We also see them described as dangerous gang members and criminals and terrorists by President Trump. They are, in fact, the victims of gangs and criminals and terrorists. American leaders in positions of responsibility used to calm unreasonable fears and provide needed perspective to our citizenry. We now have senior government leaders involved in fear-mongering and vilifying some of the most vulnerable people on earth. Let me know if any of this sounds familiar to you here in Australia. I believe our 2 countries and other countries that were in the past leaders in responding to crises and providing humanitarian leadership must work together to find new ways, creative ways, bold and daring ways to help refugees and other displaced people. We ought to stop the fear-mongering and blame shifting and responsibility shirking, and instead devote our energies and resources to resolving crises, promoting peace and stability, and collectively doing more to rescue people in jeopardy and to take actions so that people do not need to flee their homes in the first place. Thank you again to the Kaldor Center for inviting me today, and thank you all for listening.